Hi, my name is Kat, and today I will be discussing informal ULABs and three professionals' interventions and recommendations to create safer ULAB practices. To go over what ULABs are, they are used lead acid battery recycling sites, and they're typically unregulated processing of lead acid batteries, particularly waste from either electronics or discarded car batteries. They're rarely regulated and often done without proper protective gear. So, in high income countries with stricter regulations on environmental and health safety policies, they'll ship off electronic waste to lower middle income countries with more lax laws. And it creates these large sites where lead acid batteries are dumped, and the residents there rely on it to repurpose and resell as a source of stable income. So, who is at risk? These low middle income countries where the waste tends to pile up. The automotive and industrial industries primarily use lead acid batteries since they're the cheaper alternative to lithium and nickel cadmium batteries. So, notable low middle income countries that have a lot of these sites are typically in Africa and Southeast Asia and include Bangladesh, Senegal, Kenya, and Nigeria. There are a lot of health and environmental hazards associated with ULAB use and long-term exposure. So in the environment in many low middle income countries, they're operated in the open air in densely populated areas. So even though people might have direct contact with lead acid batteries, because it is so densely populated and the air is so thick with pollutants, people could get secondhand pollution from not even interacting with them directly. The lead particles and fumes are emitted into the air, and they can even be in the soil and water that people drink. But the main route is inhalation. In terms of human health, they lead to consistent lead exposure and lead poisoning through inhalation and direct handling of lead acid containing materials, and again through soil and water. Particularly in children, lead poisoning can be very detrimental to their health. It can cause irreversible brain damage. And for adults with lead poisoning, they can experience fatigue, damage to the brain, kidneys, and the nervous system. The three professionals that I interviewed are Nick, who is a sanitation worker, Jen, who is a teacher, and Liz, who is a lawyer. They all work for New York. Nick works for the Department of Sanitation, Jen works for the Department of Education, and Liz works at a private corporate law firm, each of them having 15 plus years of experience in their respective fields. So, to go over what Nick was thinking when he was giving his recommendations, um, in the DSNY, they're given a stipend of $1,000 to buy protective equipment. So they typically wear like gloves and hard toed shoes um, because they're handling garbage all day. So he recommended to distribute protective equipment to protect ULAB participants. Um, Maybe not necessarily give them a stipend because he did mention that the $1,000 that they were given was most of the time pocketed. So instead, working with and relying on non-governmental and volunteer organizations to actually distribute the equipment and supply the equipment to people who are interacting with lead acid batteries. Um, and again, as a DSNY worker, he relies heavily on organizations like OSHA to protect its workers from unsafe practices. So, in low middle income countries in particular, since they need to make a living off of these ULAB batteries to resell them, um, he wants to influence those countries to regulate safer practices, in particular for children who may be around there because there is no other maybe relative to take care of them at the time. So enforcing stricter protections like we have here in the US, OSHA. So moving on to Jen, who's a teacher. She, when I spoke to her, had an interesting point of view because she thought that the United States, as one of the high income countries who contributes to lead acid battery waste, we have an obligation to help lower income countries with issues like this. So she expressed to me that this was her first time hearing about ULabs and didn't even know that there were these sites with mounds of electronic waste that people were repurposing and attempting to resell. Um, so her main focus was educating people in the US and people in low middle income countries to practice safer electronic waste disposals. Um, But her main emphasis was in the United States, especially with people who may be consuming a lot of electronic devices and might be buying them when the new one comes out. She said that maybe letting people know of the dangers and what goes on in low middle income countries, that it could potentially encourage people to try to find different ways to dispose of these batteries. And lastly, I spoke to Liz, who is a corporate lawyer, and she recommended stricter regulations on who can participate in ULABs. I know sometimes in the video that I showed her, there were a lot of children running around in the lead acid battery sites. So having people to enforce strict regulations where only a certain age group of people are allowed into these ULABs rather than letting anyone kind of show up, especially children, and the risk associated in children in particular with lead exposure. And in addition, for those who are going to handle lead acid materials, offer them free screenings and lead poisoning checks since the residents rely on them for a source of income. But she really did emphasize the importance of actually enforcing these regulations and laws, because without enforcement, then you're just kind of saying something and you need that backing to ensure that people won't actually do it. So the main takeaway that I got from this was, rather than preventing participation in ULABs entirely, it's to encourage participants to engage in ULABs in the safest way possible, since it is a source of income in many low middle income countries. So the final recommendations that the four of us came up with is educating both people in the United States and low middle income countries, to spread awareness about safe electronic waste practices and be conscious of electronic consumerism, particularly in the United States, and then implementing education programs targeting participants of ULABs in low middle income countries. And it'll be really important to partner with non-governmental organizations and rely on volunteer groups, since the United States still did pull out of the WHO. A lot of the funding is no longer available. Um, so really relying on local support is extremely important. Second, free screenings for people who do participate in ULABs. So to check their blood either monthly or bi-monthly to ensure that their lead blood levels are not exceeding a certain threshold. And lastly, distributing PPE for any participant. So goggles, masks, closed-toed shoes, gloves, and collaborate with the ministries of health and non-governmental organizations again to distribute these. The main takeaway that I got from this is that each of the three professionals that I interviewed really were compassionate and very supportive towards people, because they recognize that this is a source of income, and for low middle income individuals, and approaching policies in a way where you're thinking about these people compassionately and supportively are necessary in public health. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please let me know. Bye.